kind of a 10-year labor of love, we thought, what was different about the plays? So we spent the last 10 years or so going through plays. Thank you to the Library for the Performing Arts. And there are a lot of fine plays that either were never made into movies, maybe were successful in London but not in New York, or vice versa. And so what we've been doing is looking at them, and so we're just delighted that the Metropolitan put on one of those plays from before the United States got into the war that is just so important. This play was not that successful in New York, but tremendously successful in London. And so it's wonderful to see it.
One of the things, two things surprised us when we started looking at the plays as opposed to movies. One is that the first explicitly anti-Nazi movie was probably Confessions of a Nazi Spy in 1939. The first explicitly anti-Nazi Broadway play was called Culture, and it premiered on September 26, 1933, less than 9 months after Hitler came to power. So there were, New York theater was involved in the politics of Europe and Asia, and whether we should be getting involved in the war, why Nazism was bad, why fascism was a threat, long before Hollywood had the nerve to. So that surprised us. We had like almost a whole another decade of plays to deal with, and we had movies. And the other was kind of connected to that, is that movies, for a lot of reasons, tended to be kind of carry the official narratives of the war, to explain to the movie-going public why we needed to be in the war, why our allies had to be supported, why our enemies had to be defeated. And not that they were never critical of what was going on, but they tended to be generally positively supportive. The Office of War Information was one government agency that, provided guidelines for what kinds of messages the movies ought to be sending. There was nothing like that with theater, and so the theater tended to be a lot more contentious. There were a lot of different points of view. This was especially true in the years before Pearl Harbor, before the U.S. got into the war, and also towards the end of the war, which is, I think, the two periods that we find most interesting, because you got, in 1937, 38, 39, when a play like Thunder Rock was being done, there were all sorts of plays giving different points of view about fascism, about whether the U.S. should be involved in the war or not, whether we ought to be supporting Britain or not. And so this is a great example, kind of like we talk about it as being an example of kind of a existential crisis. The coming out of the Depression with the world seemingly heading towards war. How does somebody find meaning in a world like that? And Thunder Rock is a terrific example of it, though there are others as well.
True. I mean, but you can see from the character of Charleston that Charleston was observed the Spanish Civil War, and so has been very disillusioned. We have a lot of other people who served in World War I, and the last time we were in France, we took a tour of one of the battlefields of World War I, the Somme, where I had a great uncle who died. And you think to yourself, we just went through a war. Why would we possibly want to get involved again? It's true that the Nazis are awful, Hitler's awful, and so forth. But we've just been through it. We've been through that. We've been through a depression, and I think it's easy for somebody like Charleston. And he's very sympathetic in many ways. Why do we want to go through that again? Can't we just kind of like go back to our own little hole and just stay there where it's seemingly safer? Because if you venture out again, it's dangerous. You might die. Other people are going to die. And so it's so important to the conversations that he has with Streeter, because he's kind of trying to work out in his own mind why somebody like Streeter would go and basically become part of the Flying Tigers is what happens to him.
Right. So just to talk a little bit about the play itself, it's there are different versions of the third act that are floating around. The version that we saw tonight, this afternoon, was the one that's in the acting version, right? The Dramas Play service.
The current version, but I'm going to move over so some of the actors can come in and join us in the audience and on the stage. I think out of a volume that was published by Robert Ardrey in the 50s, the plays of 3 decades, which includes his Jeb, Thunder Rock, and Shadow of Heroes, which we did last year.
Yeah, the that version that plays the 3 decades. The third act, compared to the Dramas Play Service version that we had, is condensed a little bit in places. It's not, the message doesn't change at all, the action doesn't change at all, but it's made a little tighter. But when it was done on Broadway, there was a scene inserted towards the end where the ghost of Streeter comes back and appears to Charleston, and Charleston has a very impassioned speech about the importance of the United States not getting involved in the war in Europe. That we need to set an example to the world by living in peace. And I get the impression from what I've read from what Artery writing about this play, he never really acknowledged that. I'm not sure that he was ever wholeheartedly behind that insertion. I think that there were other pressures.
Yeah. And some of the other pressures, the group theater was the original producers on Broadway, and many of the people who were in the group theater were either members of the Communist Party or were sympathetic to the communists. And at this time, there was a non-aggression pact between Russia and Germany. And so if the United States entered the war against Germany, they'd be entering the war against Russia. And that, for people who are communist sympathizers of one sort or another, was very difficult to deal with. So some of the powers that be in the group theater were pressing more for the not being involved, not being interventionist. And there are other plays in the early to mid 30s like this as well, where what is the name of that play with the woman president who?
Oh, If This Be Treason?
Yes, and there's the hint of a war between the United States and Japan. And what happens, rather than go to war, which is what everybody is encouraging the United States to do, she says, no, I'm going to go and sue for peace. We're going to go, we're going to talk about it, and it'll be settled that way. I mean, there are a couple of rather idealistic plays like that. But so the push is, especially from some members of the group theater, and the group theater, of course, was a very democratic organization in the sense that everybody was supposed to have a voice, that they would push for something that didn't want Charleston necessarily to go off and fight.
And the show is not very successful on Broadway. Ran about 2 weeks. But then, not long afterwards, it was done in London. It was very successful there. And Ardrey writes someplace that he thinks it's a play that speaks to desperate people in desperate times, and that's when it's done in those situations, it's successful. And then eventually, after the war, the movie was made, right?
Yes.
Has anybody seen the film?
Yeah.
Michael Redgrave.
42 though, actually. It wasn't over yet.
Oh, is it? I thought it was okay, but it's rather different because it contains a lot of flashbacks to the ghost characters' past lives. But it's real interesting.
Yes, yeah, it is. And one of the things, and that's part of the reason for the handout, is that the plays that were connected to the war, that were opening on either side of Thunder Rock, are taking a slightly different tack. So you have the very political theater of the 30s, but then you have the let's not take it too seriously version of it. So, for example, one of the other plays that opens, I think, right before Thunder Rock is Margin for Error, a wonderful play about a Jewish policeman guarding the German consulate in New York. And Otto Preminger is the horrible Nazi consul, and he dies. And I don't want to give away the plot because it's a really good show. But
submissions are always welcome.
but there are a lot of people suspected of the murder. But it's sort of a comedy murder mystery, but it's a really awful Nazi at the same time. So there's a real sense of ambivalence in the Broadway community about how seriously one should take the Nazi threat.
Sure. Well, we probably talked over.
We should mention Let's Face It.
Oh!
Yes, I know you. Yes. Yes, I wanted to acknowledge Howard not only for his fine performance tonight, but 40 years ago, Peter Paulino, who was my producing partner at the time, was producing shows off and off Broadway, and we did a Cole Porter musical called Let's Face It, which was which was a lot of fun. And Howard was one of the 3 young soldiers.
Go, Howard.
But you stuck with the business, and I got a PhD. I guess we'll open it up for questions, yeah.
Before we do, I'd like to acknowledge someone who may not want to be acknowledged, so I leave it to.
Are you going to experience hate kind of situations?
Who did you know? Your grandfather?
No, it was my mother. She played one of the female leads, I just don't recall which one. But she always had the highest praise for Thunder Rock. Yeah, this is the second production of it that I've seen. I saw one a few years ago with my mom. So, and she had such a blast talking with the actors afterwards.
Yes, my question was the London production the same as the one on Broadway with the speech at the end, or was it this?
I don't believe they did it with the speech. As I said, I don't think Ardrey ever really accepted that
And are
speech
there,
as being
is there
part of the
more,
play.
are there more versions than those 2?
No, as I said, there's some what I would consider minor differences between the version that was published in his Plays of 3 Decades and the Dramatist Play Service version, but nothing significant, nothing that really changes the meaning of the show, the way that I mean, I not having seen it, it's hard to judge. It strikes me the way that I've read about this speech, it seems very intrusive. But I could be wrong. Maybe if I saw it, I think it was wonderful.
Because Streeter comes back as
Yeah.
a ghost and is talking, is basically saying, I gave my life for this, and the implication is that Charleston ought to do the same, because, if we all just sit back and let somebody else deal with whatever these issues are, the world's going to be an even worse place, and so therefore the impetus is that way. But, of course, if you're thinking about the London production, Britain was in a much different place than the United States in 1939 and 1940. By that time, Poland was invaded in September 1st, 1939, and so by this time, Great Britain is under a lot more threat, say, than the United States. For them, it's just kind of happening somewhere else. So let the somewhere else's take care of it.
I mean, in the London production, of course, they had to cancel performances because of the Blitz, the bombing raids.
They say it was closed. It was done at the Globe Theater. This is a program from the Globe Theater production, and it was closed because the theater next to it was.
She's not a loose yet.
But the question is, all right, so we have people like Robert Sherwood writing There Shall Be Some Night, There Shall Be No Night, which is about the Finnish Soviet War. But you have a situation where the Molotov-von Ribbentrop Pact is signed, and Britain is at war in 1939, and September 1st, and they are not at war with the Soviet Union. So the United States sees that, and obviously people in the theater see that it is possible to go to war even with the pact, which goes on until May of 1941. It is possible to go to war with with Nazi Germany, against Nazi Germany, without being at war with the Soviet Union. So how did groups, people in the theater, such as a group theater, such as, and I know what Stella Adler's version of the von Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact was, but how did they think in those terms then? Because they knew what the Nazis represented. And they also saw at that time that Britain, which was fighting the war for fully a third of it before we even got into it, they saw that Britain was able to do it without directly involving the Soviet Union. How did they maneuver through that?
Looking at theater during the war, there seemed to be sort of waves of types of plays, and so there's a wave of British plays of London under the Blitz, for example, in the 39, 40, 41 time frame. Interestingly, most of them didn't do very well. A lot of Americans just didn't want to hear about it. And isolationist sentiment was very, very prevalent up until pretty close to Pearl Harbor. So I mean, it would not have been a minority opinion. So there were probably about half a dozen plays that transferred from London to New York, and only one of them was even mildly successful.
The Wookiee.
The Wookiee.
Yeah. Which is a better play than the title would suggest. It has nothing to do with Star Wars. Yeah, I mean, there are some scholars writing about plays during the war, or art in general during the war, who they seem to see more artists following like the directives of the Communist Party USA at various times than I think we do. There certainly were some who would, Communist Party USA says, oh, now we want to push anti-interventionism right now, and they would go along with that. For the most part, we're not seeing that pattern, certainly not in the theater, because there are plays with different kinds of messages showing up at different times or at the same time, or playwrights who are writing about pacifism in 1 year, 3 years later are writing in favor of interventionism. There Shall Be No Night, a few years earlier, he'd written Idiot's Delight, which has a very different message, right? Or Irwin Shaw with Bury the Dead versus The Gentle People, that was another group show.
That was another group show, yeah.
So it's the political positions were kind of all over the place, which is one of the things that we find interesting. And I think Sally's right too, is that although many of the artists in New York, the playwrights and the actors and producers, were very interested in the politics at the time, it's not always clear that the audiences were. The Margin for Error, which Sally mentioned a little bit ago, was the first play about the international situation that turned a profit. So there were like 7 years of plays before that ran but didn't run successfully.
Yeah, and I mean, and some of those, Margin for Error, as I said, takes the war sort of lightly. I mean, it takes the whole situation of the Nazis abroad in kind of a light way. But some of the most successful theatrical productions at the beginning of the war were not very war-related, or we're not very serious about. And let's face it, is a terrific example, because it shows up at the beginning of the war and runs several years. It's an incredibly successful show. It's one of the most successful musicals of the entire war period, and it's basically a draft comedy. 3 young men are drafted and they sing a lot. They fool around with some girls, and
It made a star with Danny Kaye. Well, it was
It
his
did.
first big starring role after Lady in the Dark.
it's true. But that's what appealed to people. So although there are all of these serious plays about the war and about various kinds of political situations, some of the most popular things were much lighter. Oddly enough, burlesque and vaudeville made a really big comeback during the war.
That's right. Well, they were less expensive to put on, for
Well,
one
sure.
thing,
Yes.
Another question.
Yes.
I think the lighter things help people take their mind off the war. It's not that it wasn't a serious issue, it's that people needed relief from that. But when I'm looking at the perspective of my week, where I had on the one hand this amazing play today, as well as the previous time that I went a few weeks ago, as combined with the experience of anti-Semitism at work, combined with that same day going to a rally about the impeachment, the message I get from all of that in these times is stand up, speak out. Because one of the worst problems of terrible things in the world, which I think the Robert Ivory play is hinting at, is if you don't do anything, then it leads to worse problems.
And one of the other things too is that there are different ways of dealing with it. Speaking out is one. Sometimes making light of it in the sense of trying to show up the Nazis for being kind of stupid and misguided is a way to do it, because, you know, by making light of them, for example.
Making them laughable.
Yes, the Jack Benny film.
To be or not to be.
To be or not to be, yes. I mean, that's a perfect example, because, you know, they're Nazis, they've invaded the country, they're doing all sorts of terrible things, but a lot of the German soldiers are even at the officer level are shown as laughable. And in a sense, it's a way to gain power over an awful situation, is to make light of, not to make light of it, but to make them seem less overpowering, because, you know, if something seems overpowering, I mean, poor Charleston, for example, the world seems so overpowering that the only thing to do is to just kind of hide, to isolate yourself. And if you can say, okay, well, yes, this is awful, but, well, you know, there's really ways to overcome it, that can actually make you feel more powerful yourself.
Yeah, I'm trying to put some of the symbolism of the play into context, because it seems a very serious play, actually. You know, there's the lighthouse, of course, you know, I guess trying to shed light on the situation that maybe people don't want to see. But there's also the ship of people that sinks on the rocks, and the mother and daughter who die in childbirth. And I'm not quite sure I put that all together, and I was wondering if you had thoughts on it, or how the actors related.
In a lot of plays and movies of the time, light as a metaphor shows up a lot. There's the famous line from Lord Grey about the lights going out all over Europe, and that's referenced in a lot of different plays and so forth. So the whole idea of light being about knowledge, about enlightenment, and so forth. So in a sense, the lighthouse stands for that. Is kind of like a last bulwark, or a last beacon against ignorance, against terror.
The original title for the play was Tower of Light.
And you have to see what's happening, right? But what about the ship that sinks and the mother and the daughter that die? What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, it's I mean, to me, it's all this unresolved promise, because, you know, Dr. Kurtz, for example, he had the promise to do the anesthetic, and the mother and the daughter, obviously, a lot of them had lives to fulfill, and they were cut short. And across Europe, we're seeing this. I mean, across lots of Asia too, we're seeing lives that were cut short, lives that had lots of promise, many brilliant people who were tortured or died or so forth. And, you know, you could just kind of say, well, it's elsewhere, let it happen. And I mean, so they're kind of an example of using this country as sort of a metaphor for this new promise, a new land, a new life, a new beginning. And it doesn't work out, but, you know, you can either take from it, well, it doesn't work out, so maybe we're right, we should all stay on the rock, or it doesn't work out, but, you know, Captain, you know, when Dr. Kurtz is saying, well, it didn't work out for us, but that doesn't mean that everybody else should stop too, because, well, it's very defeatist, and if you feel that way, the world is just going to kind of, you know, devolve rather than move forward.
If I might, from the inside, I felt that the situation with the various ghosts gives real weight to Dr. Kurtz's line about how men may die, but mankind can never. It gives the context for that, because everyone's trying. We're already dead. We don't know it yet, but none of us is ever going to succeed. But that doesn't stop us from keeping at it until the last possible moment. That was kind of my impression of it.
Sure, as a human being, that's what you want.
It's what you do
Yeah,
until you
true.
can't anymore.
That's true.
And that seems to be, it's an unspoken optimism, but you just keep on going.
Could you just say a little?
Part that basically undercuts the whole thing of the play in some way?
Well, undercut might be a little strong, but I mean, I think that the way that the little scene was supposed to work was that, you know, Charleston at the end is still convinced that yes, you need to do something to make the better world come sooner, and the way that we can do that is by preserving peace in the United States and set an example to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
But it was a pretty explicit call for, we don't want to get involved in this war. There's, again, you know, what I've read, Ardrey writing about the play, he doesn't talk about it. He kind of has a vague reference to a couple of pages that were changed near the end, but he doesn't go into detail. There's a scholar named Albert Wertheim who has a book called Staging the War, and he argues in that it was there were members of the group theater who were very into the anti-interventionist position, and that it was primarily through their influence that this was added. I don't know what his evidence for that is, but that's what he's arguing. I haven't actually seen any documents primary documents that would suggest that.
But there's no question that in fact it was in.
Oh no, it was in. It was performed. The reviewers mentioned it for the New York production.
Right now in the London, it was not in the London production.
I think not.
Well, no, well, of course not.
No,
I
mean, I'm not. I don't mean to criticize you, but
No,
that would be like
of
insane.
course not. I mean, you know, if it's a different country, it's a different time for them. But yeah, what's interesting about it is kind of how the various political things at home are affecting the ending of a play that's talking about whether or not, well, Charleston, by extension, Charleston becomes the country itself, whether we should get involved or not.
Ardrey wrote a piece, I think, for the New York Times around the time the play opened. It was kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing called "What It's Like for a Playwright to Work with a Group Theater," and it was kind of like, you know, other plays I've done. The director comes and talks to me, and that's this. This time, the lighting designer came to me and said, "How do I solve this problem?" I don't know. I'm a playwright. And the actors come up and, "Can we change this?" And I don't know. I mean, so I wonder whether some of the subtext to that is kind of connected to this idea that. If Wertheim is right, that it was because of pressure from the actors that this change was made. I don't know. But,
I just want to know if how the Hitler-Stalin Pact, which others have other names for it, the Hitler-Stalin Pact had like 3 days. One day there was the situation where the Soviet wanted peace, and then the next day, after there was silence when things shuffled to get the next position, and then the third day is when we want not peace but war against the Soviet, etc. That's such a significant contradiction and so historic. I would imagine that anything that touches that, including this play, directly or indirectly, would be influenced by it because it was so pronounced.
And you know, that's true of the theater and of the movies at the time too, because you know, prior to our involvement in the, you know, our involvement in the war, Russians, for example, were often portrayed as, you know, they're kind of folky peasant sort of people, or but not to be taken very seriously. And then once the Russians become our allies, there's a whole spate of films. You know, almost every studio had a film about our Russian allies. And of course, the political pendulum swings back again. And after the war, and the Russians are no longer our allies, those same people who made films at the encouragement of the U.S. government are now being blacklisted because, you know, they weren't our friends anymore. And so you know, you see that in a lot of the popular culture, and it's kind of moved by the situation. I mean, there's like one film, for example, about the Russian invasion of Finland, but it doesn't last very long because it's just sort of I hate to call it a blip because it was a terrible thing, but in terms of the way popular culture represented it, it was just a very short thing.
John, go.
I have a wartime Peter and the Wolf, narrated by Basil Rathbone, and the album copy goes straight into how young Peter is a model vision of Soviet youth. And this is an American album.
One of the things that when we were working on the movie book, one of the things that we found was that, you know, one of the reasons that a lot of these movies from the 40s survived is that they wanted them for television in the 1950s. Well, nobody in television wanted to show pro-Soviet movies in the 1950s, so it's hard to get a hold of some of these. What's the Three Girls from Moscow? Is that the one we're trying to get?
No, we just got the boy from
Oh,
Stalingrad.
Boys in Stalingrad, I finally saw it. Isn't there Three Girls from Leningrad? Something.
Yeah.
It sounds good, but we've never seen it. So those were hard to get, but and then the North Star got recut in the 50s to make it anti-Soviet instead of pro-Soviet. It's
Yeah.
just-
Armored attack.
Armored attack,
Yeah.
yeah, armored attack
They
is
cut
about,
out an hour of film.
yeah. It's
We're
much
running
shorter.
close to the end of our time. We have a question.
Did you say who wrote those changes in the script, by the way?
I don't know. I'm assuming that it was Ardrey, but I could be wrong. Since again, I haven't seen. I'm getting all this through secondary sources. I haven't seen the primary documents.
I mean, he may have had help.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, the group theater was, well, as Bob said, like about the lighting and whatnot, the group theater was very participatory. And so they might have encouraged it in certain ways.
One or two more when we haven't heard from you.
I addressed this to our director and artistic director, but I presumed from little knowledge of the script in advance that you chose this because of its resonance to our particular times, and I confess to having been a little skeptical about that. That sometimes is a dangerous thing to do, but I'm absolutely thrilled the way this works out. I really was pleased with both the script and the production in terms of its resonance to our times.
Thank you. Thanks very much. You sort of identified why we wanted to do it now. We've had the play for a couple of years, and it seemed a prime moment. Although someone did say last week, I think you'll find it amusing, one person commented that he wondered if he missed something in the text, because it was fine to write this in 1939, but now things are so much worse. And I thought, well, you didn't miss anything in the text.
You could always do that can't happen here in the fall.
We did. It can't happen here. But unfortunately, we were premature.
Yeah. One thing that I think is interesting to point out from a performance standpoint that actually Susanna told me about was the thing that you read, the interview with Kazan.
Oh, yes.
Because do you mind if I?
No.
Kazan, I don't know
It's
what.
autobiography, yeah.
Yeah, at one point was asked about the play, the director, and he said one of the reasons he felt it wasn't successful in the United States is because of the whole style of the group theater. And I don't know if you know, but the method basically came out of the group theater. So it was very emotional and very psychological, whereas the British production, because the British style is much more stoic and kind of withheld, and he thinks that had a lot to do with the success.
I kept saying I was a failure. I was very struck by how humble Kazan was in his autobiography about this play. Because he's not always humble and other things. But he said, I was wrong, failure, my fault.
Because if I remember right, he kind of stepped in fairly last minute. That Harold Clurman was going to direct it, and he withdrew.
And he said the actors did not have much faith in it.
I'm sorry?
The actors, the group theater actors he was saying, they did not have a lot of faith in it. They were sort of balking because they felt it was troubled and unwieldy.
True.
Yeah.
Did you have it?
I have two questions. One, what was the view or more?
The movie actually is on YouTube.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it.
It's far more manifestly anti-fascist. It places all of the characters in Europe fighting against an overwhelming establishment of some sort, whether it's Miss Kirby going to prison over and over and over again for her actions, or Kurtz being hounded out by a mob. But it makes it very, very clear that there is a sort of mob mentality that can easily be swayed to oppress an independent thinker of any sort. And it's quite striking how well that's developed. And then the scenes in the lighthouse, I think, are kind of, I don't like them. It's a little trivial. Yeah, they're not nearly as interesting emotionally, I would say.
Was where he picks up.
Doesn't take one. But the choice was about the importance of bearing witness from my point of view. So that's a little heavy-handed directorial choice, and to purposely eschew the rifle, leave the rifle behind for Cassidy to.
Just say that I think many of us feel very disheartened by what is happening in our lives today and in our country today, in the world. And I found it extremely interesting to find that we can all think this is the worst time that's ever been, and it isn't. It's in context, and that, well, but there's a reason to persist, and that's what I'm overall got from this production.
All right.
Wonderful.